All right. I can see that the floodgates are opening and there are lots of names starting to appear. All right, welcome to everyone who's signing in. All right, this is great. I'm seeing more and more names entering as we are trying to let everyone in at the same time. We'll get started in a minute or two. All right, so for those who are signing in, welcome. We're going to wait a minute or two before we start, but some have already noticed the chat feature has been left open. So as you're entering, please feel free to send a quick message to everyone saying where you're dialing in from, since we're all virtual and our panelists will not be able to see all of you. All right. All right, I'm seeing greetings from Edmonton, from Vancouver, from Fredericton, from Nebraska, from Guelph, and someone from Tokyo, Winnipeg, Saskatoon. This is great. Nanaimo, Vienna, Regina, Halifax, more people from Vancouver, Finland, Istanbul. This is excellent. Cambridge, Ontario. Great. Okay, so I think I will get us going. I think a few people might still be signing in. I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of University of Toronto Press. Just a couple of logistical notes before we officially get started. As I've already mentioned, we've got the chat function open. So if anyone wants to send a celebratory positive message to the panelists or to any of the other attendees, please feel free to use that feature. We have an agenda outlined, but please know that towards the end, we will be keeping some time for question and answers. So if at any point during the book presentations or the discussion, you have a question that you would like to have one of the panelists answer, then please enter that into the Q&A box. So if you hover your mouse towards the bottom, you'll see Q&A in addition to chat. Please use the Q&A if you want to direct some questions to any of the panelists. We will do our best to get to all of them at the end of the event. So one other thing I should note, this book launch will be live streamed on YouTube and is currently live streaming, so you can find it there as well. And there will be a recording made available at the end. So, I understand this is being in a virtual book launch is becoming a bit normal, but still important to mention, even though we are not in a physical space right now and we're spread out across the country. I wanted to mention that the University of Toronto and the University of Toronto Press is located on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So to kick things off, I would like to introduce the two series editors of the Studies in Gender and History book series. They will be your hosts for this event. So Franca Iacovetta is a professor in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. And Karen Dubinsky is professor of history and global development studies at Queen's University. And I would like to pass things over to them. And again, welcome to everyone.
Okay, well, thank you, Anna, for the introductions, and thank you, Jane, for the behind-the-scenes support, and thanks to all the authors and commentators who've assembled here today. As the series co-editors, Karen and I are delighted to celebrate the 4 books that were published in Studies in Gender and History in 2020. And with Alison Stevenson's book literally just off the printing presses today, as Len Husband let us know, our press colleague Len let us know, we're thrilled that that's happened, and it also brings the total of books in the series to 51. So pleased to celebrate that as well. These new books, like the others in the series, explore the centrality of gender along with class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and other major categories of analysis to a wide range, truly wide range of historical events, historical subjects, controversies, as well as historiographical debates. Theoretically informed and interdisciplinary, they also showcase groundbreaking historical research. So without further ado, because we have a big lineup and we're going to do this all in an hour, I'm going to turn to the first of the 3 segments around which we've organized, around which we've structured the presentations. And we've decided to all remain on the screen during everything as a kind of visual representation of feminist collaboration, but we'll divide the presentations up into 3 parts. So the first segment features Alison Stevenson's Intimate Integration, History of the 60s Scoop and the Colonization of Indigenous Kinship. And the commentator is Susan Hill, Director of the Center for Indigenous Studies and Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies and History at the University of Toronto. She's going to speak for about 3 to 4 minutes, and then followed by a brief remarks by our author, Alison, who is Gabrielle Dumont Institute Chair in Métis Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. So I pass it over to Susan.
Scano Swagwego, the Ondata ni Gaso, Otahioni Wagisho, Danganyak Kiononi Wakwenzadent. Thank you so much, Franca, for that introduction. And I send a special thanks and greetings to Alison for this beautiful piece of work that I'm very humbled to have the chance to make some brief comments about. I join you all today from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. It's interesting, one of the crazy things about the Zoom world we're all currently in is that some of us get to spend more time at home than we might normally. So that's my silver lining to the cloud of the pandemic. Another aspect of the silver lining is the opportunity to read this beautiful book. I'm still processing, and I think I will be for a long time, actually, because what Alison has produced is a work that is both highly scholarly, extremely well-researched, but also very real and very much speaks to the realities that many of us as Indigenous people live in and live with and have been impacted by. And one of the things that struck me, I think, so much in reading the book is thinking through the fact that many Indigenous families, if not most, are impacted by transracial adoption in some way. And that I don't know of any Indigenous community that isn't impacted by transracial adoption. Certainly that's the case in Canada, but also very much the case in the United States, as well as many other parts of the world. And so this story is something that resonates in a very personal way, in an intimate way, that is extremely real for Indigenous people and for Indigenous scholars. And so while she has created a piece that is, as I said, extremely scholarly aspect that we deal with, and that often is an important aspect of the work we do in Indigenous studies in particular, and something that I think that we contribute greatly to the work of history more broadly in terms of the realities that whenever we're writing about history, we're writing about people's lives, that these were real people who endured real things, and that it's important to bring to it an ethic of care and respect and honor in how we process that material. And Allison has definitely done that with this text. Particularly what I've been struck by in my thinking so far are about the tools that Allison provides for us, for those of us who train students, and what tools can students get from reading Allison's book. And it's a beautiful synthesis of a lot of different tools that students will get into their toolbox from this process, particularly Allison's analysis of federal and provincial policy, and being able to contextualize that in its impact on the emergence of transracial adoption for Indigenous people, particularly in Saskatchewan, but it speaks in a much broader way to many other aspects of Canada. And I would suggest as well has a lot to teach us about the impact of adoption and the process of adoption that comes out of British policy, and then thinking through the implications of that for all of us who live in British settler states. Another aspect is the questions around intersectionality that are always so important for scholars of Indigenous studies, and I would suggest important tools to be taken up on a greater level by historians. And as well, the interactions between the child welfare authorities and the perceptions around transracial adoption, and analyzing through different narratives to think through making sense of some of these things. And Allison's work has so much to say about those processes that, again, I would also suggest that students of social work should definitely take up the work that Allison has shared with us. Your continual reference in a very beautiful way, talking about resistance and insistence, I think is another set of analysis that becomes really important and useful for scholars of Indigenous histories. And I loved that use of insistence that you mirror throughout the text and weave really through the stories. I would also say that in reading the book, I was very much taken to the homelands of your people and thinking through the way that land and those waters help you to tell your story and to tell the histories of the families that you're talking about and the individuals. So as I said, I have lots more to think about, but I didn't want to take up tons of time. I just want to endorse very highly the value of this text. And I believe that it's one that we're going to be using a lot in various Indigenous studies classrooms and various history classrooms. So nyawa so much, Allison, for this text. And many thanks again to those who invited me to participate today. Ona.
Thank you, Sue. Allison.
Oh, wow, I think I was holding my breath the entire time Susan was speaking. Thank you, Marcy, Susan, for that endorsement. I feel like I'm quite emotional now. So I really appreciated your kind words and how you've really engaged with the work that I've put out into the world now. And I just really want to thank, of course, you for your comments and your warmth and your connection and the way in which you have pointed out that it's something that it's really touched so many of our families across not only Canada, the US, but elsewhere, of course, Australia, New Zealand. So I also want to thank the editors also for Karen for inviting me to participate in the series. And Franca as well for overseeing the work as it comes now out into the world. And I really just appreciate being included in this very prestigious this collection. And of course, everyone that's attending here today, thank you for participating in this. And so this originally began as my PhD dissertation in 2007. And at that time, my oldest daughter was 9, my son was 7, and my twins weren't quite yet 2. And now my oldest daughter's finishing university. My son has joined the work world, and my daughters are taking driver training. and so it's a lot has changed in my life. And of course, my husband has supported me all along the way, as has the rest of my family. And so I'm very grateful for their support and really the way they've stood beside me as I've grappled with this very personal topic. My book, Intimate Integration, is a labor of love. It started as an idea when I was still in my master's, but really it's when I think about it, it's always been with me. As an adoptee, it's been part of me my whole life. And so to launch it today is really satisfying. And I feel like now I can share this, which I feel like has been in many ways a burden for me. Now I can share this with not only my colleagues, with students, with others. So I appreciate that now this my book is out in the world, and I can share some of which has been deeply personal, but of course deeply political too. So at the core of Intimate Integration is really my attempt to understand and explain the 60s scoop, and then by extension, the overrepresentation of Indigenous children today in Canada. I hope, I aspire, it was my goal to unpack things like jurisdictional issues that we hear often in the news or in other places, what that means in the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people, unpack sexism in the Indian Act, Métis marginalization, settler colonialism, and the effective politics of Indigenous integration in the post-war period. Indigenous resistance also forms a central and persistent thread that we see today, perhaps in the work of Cindy Blackstock and others that continue to press back against the removal of Indigenous children. With that, I just want to say that I'm thankful and grateful and deeply, deeply moved by my friends, my mentors, supervisors, editors, reviewers, and colleagues for their important part in bringing this into the world today. Marcy.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Sue and Allison, for starting us off in such a strong and moving way. I thank you. And with that, we'll move on to the second presentation, which features Laurie Bertram's The Viking Immigrants, Icelandic North Americans. And in this case, the commentator is Marlene Epp, Professor of History at the University of Waterloo. And her commentary will be followed by some comments by Laurie herself, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Toronto. I hand it over to Marlene.
Thanks, Franca. Well, first of all, I'd just like to congratulate Karen and Franca for their long-term editorship of this really outstanding series, over 50 titles in 25 years, so it's wonderful. I am absolutely delighted to introduce you to L.K. Bertram's The Viking Immigrants, Icelandic North Americans. And first, I will say that I just love this book. I think it's among the most engaging of immigration histories I've read of late. Bertram's subject is the community of Icelandic immigrants who created new homes in Canada and the US beginning in 1870. Many aspects of the study take us right up to the present day. And so we see how a group of settlers, who probably still call themselves immigrants, transform identities and navigate relationships over 150 years. So I'm thinking this is a great anniversary book for the Icelandic community. Bertram asks questions common to historians of migration and colonization. How did newcomers integrate and interact? How were they perceived? What changed and what did not in their culture, politics, and belief systems? But she responds to these queries in fresh and novel ways by adopting a sensory approach to the past. How did the Icelandic immigrants' sense of touch, smell, and taste form their identities in new human and natural environments? Bertram investigates Icelandic customs and habits, what we often call the everyday, including clothing, coffee, cake. as well as traditional thought systems that embraced the supernatural and Viking imagery. So yes, this book has ghosts and Vikings. And I see a Netflix series, Lori. The transformation in these habits and beliefs over time reveal many things, and I can only really briefly touch on a few examples that demonstrate this fresh approach to immigration history. Bertram describes clothing exchanges between Icelandic settlers and their Cree, Ojibwe, and Métis neighbors, pointing out the genius of indigenous clothing embraced by the newcomers. Yet she importantly counters the pervasive myth of good relations between First Nations and Icelandic settlers. Bertram interprets certain Icelandic ghost stories, new ones that emerged in North America, as devices for processing the trauma and power of colonialism. In effect, the settlers were haunted by their roles in colonial displacement. Gender is, of course, a theme throughout the book. Women played a significant role in the perpetuation and transformation of everyday practices, which in turn were pivotal in situating Icelandic immigrants in Anglo-North American society. Fashion became a vehicle for immigrant women in the city to reject homeland hierarchies of gender and class. Women's bodies were used to both vilify and vindicate Icelandic people in the public eye. The recreation of an Icelandic food tradition, the famous cake viniterta, offered women a tool for political expression during the Cold War. And you will just have to buy the book to find out the connections between cake and the Cold War. In this book, Bertram analyzes immigration as a three-dimensional experience, an interplay between the body, space, and material world. And I'll end, I want to offer one quote just to give you a sense of the beautiful writing in this book. Bertram says, "From the feel of woolen cloth to the smell of fresh roasting coffee, or the intense feeling of winter cold around Lake Winnipeg, migrants encountered North America through a range of scents, which shaped how they responded to their new environment." Congratulations, Lori.
Thank you, Marlene, and I'll pass it on to Lori.
Thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you to everyone for having me here today. It's a real honor. There's so many people that I would like to thank, and I was worried that I might break a record in my acknowledgement section of this book because it just kept going and going. And that's because there were so many people that helped me. A lot of them I can't name today, but first and foremost would be my supervisor, Frankie Yakaveda, who took me on as a PhD student. My mother was reminding me, she's like, "Do you remember when she said that she'd take you on as a student, how excited you were?" So it is really this is a special day for me. I also want to thank Shirk and Ranis, which is the Icelandic equivalent of Shirk, University of Toronto Press, the academic community at University of Toronto that has been so supportive, and yeah, everyone who's here today. So this is a book that reflects a lot of the larger influences in the field of gender history in Canada, and how the value, when we place that value on gender and the everyday lives and experiences of women and children, it changes how we see the past. So it's an honor to be a part of this historic series, and its larger legacy of changing how we talk about history. So having become a parent also, and Allison, we're twins. I also have twins. I think like becoming the mother of twins completely changed how I saw the relationship between gender and labor. It was, yeah, very transformative, and changed also how I related to the people that I studied and how their labor, how they experience labor, their innovation, their power, their ability. It was pretty interesting. but it made me understand that this gendered labor has a legacy, has these large legacies. And so it was an honor for me to trace that in my own community. So this is the story of a community that is, like, for many people, looks very small. But it's one that I think is important, in Canada and at home in Iceland and the Nordic countries in Scandinavia. As Marlene points out, this is the 150th anniversary of the official start of mass migration to Icelandic mass migration to North America, and almost a quarter of the population of Iceland came here and relocated. So I hope that this can, contribute to the field of Canadian history, but I also am looking forward to this book going home to Iceland 150 years later. There hasn't been a lot of work produced on our community for Icelandic audiences. And when you go to places like the National Museum in Iceland, the memory of this mass migration is virtually erased. So I can't help but feel that this amnesia about the 19th century migrant past, not just in Iceland, but also in Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark, in Finland, this lack of connection to the immigrant experience, and also how these European countries benefited so much from migration. How there's not a relationship between that forgetting and the violence and discrimination that migrants face when they enter those countries today. And so I hope that this can be part of a larger conversation in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries about how their own relationship to migration needs to be front and center when they're thinking about, like, the centrality of migration in the modern nation as they move forward. So I look forward to seeing what happens with this project now that it's out of the gate. Writing this book was one of the most memorable parts of my life. I was looking over some of the things that happened. Like, I probably ate like about 40 pounds of Wiener Tarta. I probably drank like 1,000 gallons of coffee. I gave birth to twins. I did research in not one, but 2 haunted houses. And not one, but 2 volcanoes also went off that, like, complicated the whole process of research. So I hope that this book is as even a fraction as enjoyable to read as it was to write. Thanks very much for having me today.
Hey, thank you, Lori. I think all of us who are migration historians are certainly thinking along the lines you are too, about nations who send out people ought to be thinking more carefully and with consideration for people trying to get into their country. So we shall move on to the third segment, which actually features 2 books. So the first is Nadia Jones-Gilani's Transnational Identity and Memory Making in the Lives of Iraqi Women in Diaspora, and then Danica Belisle's Purchasing Power, Women in the Rise of Canadian Consumer Culture. The commentator in this case is Donna Gabacha, Professor Emerita of the University of Toronto, and she's going to get a little bit more time because we've given her 2 books. And then her comments will be followed by the authors themselves. Nadia, who is assistant professor at Central European University, and Danica, who is associate professor of history at the University of Regina. So pass it on to you, Donna.
Wow, this is very exciting. I think actually this is the first book launch in which I've participated in Canada since I arrived here 5 years ago. So thanks, it's really great to be among you. I have to confess though that when Franca initially requested that I comment on these 2 books by Danica and Nadia, I was feeling a little overwhelmed. I'm a comparativist, but common sense always warns against comparing apples and oranges. And although these are beautiful apples and beautiful oranges, I don't need, I think, to belabor the vast differences in the focus periodization, methodology, and historiography that we see in these 2 books. Danica's Purchasing Power, Women and the Rise of Canadian Consumer Culture, focuses quite tightly on Canada. And although she clearly takes regional, cultural, rural, urban differences into account, her archival methods and the published sources that she uses for the years between 1890 and 1930s. Certainly, it allows us to learn mainly about white middle-class literate, French and English-speaking women, but how they use consumerism to other women unlike themselves becomes a fairly obvious and important theme in the book, as does the difficult to attain and fraught nature of political action based on consumerist agendas and identities, which are inevitably fragmented by that othering. We certainly get a sense of the place of these women in a capitalist and Canadian economy. Danica really does make a convincing case that women's concerns with consumption of food and their concerns with dress and the making of homes were fairly broadly shared across Canada's many cultures, including to some degree its immigrant. And we learn less, obviously, about Indigenous women here. For Nadia, in Transnational Identity and Memory Making in the Lives of Iraqi Women in Diaspora, we find focus, methods, sources that couldn't be more different. And yet, surprisingly, some very similar themes emerge in this book. Nadia examines Iraqi women in several diasporic sites, 3 of them actually, Toronto, Amman, in Jordan, and in Detroit. She examines Iraqi women by using oral histories and through conversations that become a mechanism for teasing out women's own voices, especially as they attempt to forge a national identity through the creation and sharing of memories. The focus of the book's first chapters is national identity. And here too, we get a really complex sense of the dynamics of othering, even within a national group, as women begin to draw boundaries among Kurdish, Chaldean, and Shia Muslim and Sunni women, Muslim women. This is central to their wrestling with the meaning of gender and nationalism. Subsequent chapters focus on the sharing of sweets and coffee again. And here we see ritualized consumption really as a key marker, both of identity and of the evolving relationship of the oral historian and the female storytellers. Without a shared understanding of the consumption of sweets and beverage, the two literally cannot occupy the same discursive space. Memories cannot be shared, nor can identities easily be articulated. So the politics and choice of clothing and head covering also appear in this text, not so much as a development related to consumer culture as it is in Danica's account, but to the complicated dynamics, both within the Muslim world and in Muslim women's encounters with local gendered systems of othering. So that we see diverse femininities emerging in Jordan, the United States, and in Canada, not just because the mix of refugee women and migrant women are different there, but because they're interacting with a different hosts society. While women clearly are creating solidarities through these shared practices, whether of consumption of food and drink or of clothing, we see nothing, I think, comparable to the politicized consumer movement emerging that is described in Danica's book. And that difference itself probably constitutes a kind of key dimension of the othering that draws boundaries between Iraqi women on the one hand and the modern white Western women on the other hand. Since I'm familiar with Laurie's book and you've just heard about it, you now know that consumption and clothing figures really centrally in her book as well. And though I was unable to read Alison's book, I know that one of the keys of adoption is the reproduction of hegemonic notions of gender, in which consumption and clothing and food and appearance figure well as well there. What conclusions should we draw then from the surprising similarities that we see on display across at least 3 of these books about radically different groups of women? Let me just offer a few thoughts. Despite 30 years of deconstructing the category of women and turning our attention to the analysis of gender, I nevertheless came away from these books both impressed and maybe also a little appalled by the commonalities that just leap out of their pages around certain common themes. And I don't want to accept some kind of dystopian view that all of us historians are just like little lemmings that periodically run collectively toward the same theme and then learn that we fall collectively again off some kind of epistemological cliff. Better, I think, is that we resolve to think again a bit more about these old issues in feminist, women's, and gender history, notably that problematic catch-all umbrella term of woman. Might we need to revisit possibilities for solidarities and for politics based on some shared responsibilities for consumption of either food or consumer choices when it comes to clothing? Certainly hegemonic notions of North American gender guaranteed that consumption and consumer choices lurk in all analysis of almost all groups of 20th and 20th century women living in Canada and in many other North American cultures. At the same time, however, as my reading of Nadia's and Danika's book suggests, awareness of those sometimes imposed and sometimes embraced, but ultimately common notions of gendered expectations don't alone create an unproblematic common ground, bringing all women into solidarity, but a political history that takes into account both the power of hegemonic discourse and the material realities of women's everyday consumption and consumer choices in specific times and in specific places under the conditions of specific power dynamics of othering. I think we can begin to identify whether and perhaps when such small moments of solidarity around consumption and consumer choices could plausibly emerge. So I'll just throw it out there and say I started to think about women a lot again because of these two really terrific books. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And why don't we start with Danica, since Donna began with your book, okay? And then we'll turn to Nadia. Danica.
Hey, thank you so much. The audio is okay, right? Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for coming here today and for inviting me to be a part of it. It's really great to be here. I want to first start by saying I'm speaking to you live from my basement in beautiful Treaty 4 territory, which is the territories of the Nehiyawak, the Anishinaabeg, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis-Michif Nation. Thank you, Donna, for those comments. I hadn't really thought about consumer responsibilities in those ways before, in terms of creating commonalities among vastly diverse groups of people. So I'm going to take some time to reflect on that and think about that. And I'm going to speak a little bit more today to divisions that emerge even among consumers. So I think we can look at it in two ways, maybe solidarity and division. I'm going to keep it brief, though. I'm going to say that I wrote the book, Purchasing Power, which came out the same week that the COVID lockdowns started, March 15th. So it's kind of interesting to be talking about it now when we're experiencing another rise in COVID cases. But I wrote the book because I had just very simple questions. Why do Canadians go shopping? What are the consequences of that activity? And I had searched the literature on those topics for quite some time, and I didn't yet find that any scholar had answered these questions in ways that satisfied my own deep curiosity. And so I just went looking for answers myself. I knew that the early 20th century was particularly germane to the history of consumer culture. And I also knew that during that time in Canada, white women were particularly vocal about consumer issues. And this partially stemmed from their own privileged positions within the society. They had the means to be vocal and have their voices recorded. And they invested a lot of time in buying things, not only for themselves, but also for their families. And so I just began looking in the records of white women's organizations to find out what they were saying about shopping and commodities. And I want to take some time right now to reflect on the choice that I made when I was beginning my research program for this book, which was a choice that I made in the year 2010 when I wrote my SHIRK program of research for this study that eventually sort of solidified the methodology for this book. And when I made that choice, I decided to look at white women's groups particularly. I think if I could do this research again now, 10 years later, I would take a different tack. And I would look for sources that enabled a much broader view of consumers' perspectives. I would seek out records created by and about Indigenous, racialized, and ethnic minority women. And so, for example, I would seek out records relating to consumer culture and published in the Black Canadian press, following the example set recently by Cheryl Thompson. I would also seek out sources pertaining to home economics within residential schools. And I would, in this way, follow the examples set recently by Sarah Nickel and Mary Jane Logan McCallum. But back in 2010, when I designed my research program, I had decided that I was going to find out about the dominant consumer culture and to find out about what the privileged women within that culture were saying about shopping and about commodities. And I particularly looked in the records of the Canadian Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Institutes, the Cercle des Femmes, the National Council of Women, the Fédération Nationale Saint-Jean-Baptiste, the Household Leagues, the Consumer Leagues, and the various home economics organizations that existed at that time. And so through looking at those records, I tried to understand what consumers were saying about shopping and about goods. And at the time, my motivation was to find consumers' voices themselves and not just look at advertising and retail, which had been done countless times already. So you can see everything that I found out by reading my book. And I hope you buy the book and find out those things. But I just want to make a statement here today about whiteness and the relationship between whiteness and consumer culture. And I concluded through my research that within all of these women's various references to consumption, there was an implicit understanding that to be able to consume, or in other words, to be able to purchase the goods that were available in the capitalist marketplace at the time, it was a mark of membership in the modern Canadian polity as they understood it. And they also said that to be able to consume well, or in other words, that demonstrated taste and sophistication, that was a mark of true womanhood. And so in other words, we have these white women constructing notions about consumer entitlement and taste through their writings and their activism. And these notions of entitlement and taste as consumers were wrapped up in what it meant to be a white woman, either in English Canada or in French Canada. So I would say that although the book charts the rise of consumer culture in modern Canada, it's also a genealogy of whiteness within the white settler colonial nation. Through their buying choices, white women were expressing their status, or they thought they were expressing status, as sophisticated members of what they considered the white national community, be it either English or French. And so as I ultimately conclude in the book, purchasing power, you see my play on words there, purchasing power, it was key to notions about national belonging. If you were not white, if you did not make the right consumer choices that reflected that whiteness, you would never become a true member of the English or the French Canadian nation. And I think as I reflect on what Donna was saying today, this is a theme that's important to still consider today and to think about how people assert privilege through consumer choice and how they assert particular national identities through consumer choice. Before I stop talking, I want to thank all the people who supported me as I wrote this book. First and foremost, I want to thank my partner, David Taylor, and our kids, Leo and Nora, who were born as I was writing this book, which is why it took me so long to finish it partly. And all of our friends and family and colleagues across Canada who supported us over the last 10 years as we tried to navigate 2 careers, 2 kids, and several cross-country moves. I also want to thank SHIRK, the book's reviewers, everyone at the University of Toronto Press, everyone also, and finally, in the scholarly community from who I continue to learn and who continue to make feminist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist scholarship possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Danica. And that's It's a brave rethinking of research. Really pleased that you shared that with us. So shall we now move on to Nadia? Last but not least, Nadia.
Thank you very much, Franca. I would like to start by thanking UTP for making the book a reality, but a special thanks to Franca for seeing me through as a grad student from dissertation and all the way through to publishing this book. I don't think I would have made it here without your support. The book itself informs a discussion about how women remember and in what ways the process of memory making is gendered. The research began as a way to reconnect with family members who are arriving to Canada as refugees from Iraq. Migrating through Amman and Damascus, my family were resettled through the UNHCR to Hamilton, Ontario in 2008. I use my own family as a blueprint in the book for mapping the messiness of the entanglements that make up the Iraqi diaspora. While this is not a work of family history in the traditional sense, it centers family dynamics and affective communications that shape the ways we remember and transmit knowledge. Iraqi women's life narratives constitute sites of struggle. They're emotional testimonies of women's multi-layered identities. What I found so fascinating as I kept replaying the interviews was how women conveyed their narratives through metaphors and analogies of food, through dreams, and in shared intimacies over strong cups of Arabic coffee. Separated from my family for over 20 years, we have reconnected in Canada and threaded our family tapestry back together. The imprint of two women in particular have made this research possible. I want to say a special thanks to Shahida, my second mother. As collaborator, translator, and informant, her ways of communicating memories have had a profound impact on the book's focus, and that's the form of memory making. The second note of thanks is to my sister, Yasmin. We were separated for many years until I finally met her in Amman before she was resettled to Ontario. I think Yasmin's words best articulate for me the importance of the feminist practice of telling women's histories. So I want to end by quoting Yasmin, and she made this post on Facebook the day that she received her copy of the book in the mail. So I'm quoting, "Iraqis are emotional beings. They get moved easily, and though they have a lot to say, they chuckle sometimes and can't articulate their ideas. I always dreamed of having an older sister who would tell me stories about the world, about so many things. Transnational identity and memory making in the lives of Iraqi women in diaspora is my dream coming true. It's like a pat on the shoulder, a warm hug, a hand guiding you gently. It is with stories that we can rebuild our views, learn, and ultimately we can change the world. So I learned to dream and dream big because dreams do come true." And I hope that in some small way that the book is part of this rebuilding through storytelling. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nadia. Thank you very much. And with that, I want to thank all of the presenters for their contributions today. And I'm going to turn things over to Karen. But before I do that, we talked about having wine during this event. I actually brought a glass of wine. So with my glass of wine, I celebrate all of you and thank all of you for those terrific presentations. There's some other wine drinkers. Okay, great. I'm going to turn it over to Karen and open it up to a question and answer period. And again, thanks so much to everyone who's joined us.
Thank you, everyone, for being smart and interesting and on time, leaving us 10 minutes, exactly 10 minutes for questions. Please write your questions into the Q&A and I will read them. There's one come in already, which I will read. This is from Julia Aguiar from, I happen to know, Queen's University. This is so exciting, says Julia. I wonder if the panelists could speak about their relationships to the archives as feminist historians. if you identify as such, either generally or more specifically in relation to these projects? That's a huge question. Could you keep your answers to, I don't know, maybe 45 seconds each, whoever wants to tackle that while we wait for more questions to come in?
I could start if other people are still thinking. My relationship to the archives is fraught because I know that what is recorded in archives represents the views of people who have been privileged enough to have their views saved often. And so I try to think beyond the paper records, beyond the state archives, and look for a broader view. So although I personally love sitting in the archives, I could spend my life in there. I know that it reflects certain power dynamics.
Anyone else?
I'll just say something quickly. My relationship is also fraught. One of the ways that I dealt with what I found was a lot of censorship of the archival collections that I wanted initially to use. I mean, really, I dealt with it by building my own archive. And I think that there is something to this feminist practice of either not, finding what we need in the archives, or there has not really been material collected on specific topics. So in order to rebuild an idea of Iraqi women's lives, it did involve actually building an archive from scratch.
Allison, did you have your hand up?
I did, but I think I prefer to answer the next question. So I'll just pause and address that one once it's posed.
Okay. Seeing no other hands, am I right? I'm going to move on and read out Jessica Noguera Varela's question, who I don't know, so I can't identify where she's from. What would be your advice to doing feminist research? What kept you moving when things seemed to hit a dead end? Allison.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the question. What I would suggest is choosing a feminist supervisor. My supervisor, Valerie Kornick, was instrumental in my success as a graduate student and now as an academic. I think one of the keys was that she saw that I had all those children that I mentioned at the beginning and still believed that I could complete a PhD, which it was a grueling program. There's no doubt about it. The expectation was no different for me than anyone else. And so I think that women supporting women is really important. And I can see the fruits of that here today, just through her mentorship, through getting me to go to that very first Canadian Women's Committee on Women's History, that conference that was held in Vancouver. I think it was 2010 or maybe somewhere in there. I was a very early graduate student. And so that was the first place that I presented my research and met a lot of the women that I now consider colleagues and mentors. So that's that would be my experience, was just having feminist mentors and supervisors and surround yourself with feminist women.
Lori?
Yeah, I think that's the best advice, is that make sure you've got that good, strong support and that good, strong community that makes what you do possible. And also, I would say, I think that as historians, we really underestimate the power of going with your gut. And I think that's why all of us here have a personal connection in some way to what we write about. And there's a lot of instinct, I think, that is key to producing the histories that aren't written about yet. And for me, that would include, going with things that I really noticed a lot, but didn't even really have a word for them, or weren't even really kind of acknowledged as something that was a thing. But when you see this repetition, when you see people constantly investing their energy into something, they're telling you, from the archives or from whatever sources you're reading, this is what I value. And so you kind of follow their lead. Yeah.
Any other responses to that question? And there are no other questions yet in chat, so let me ask one while the folks are thinking about other questions. We still have another 5-ish minutes. Here's what I wonder. Some of you spoke about the work you're doing now, what has come after this project. Not everybody did, however, and I wonder if anybody wants to just obviously briefly say what you're doing now, but especially also, I'm always curious about how people pick their next project. Are you running as far as possible away from the kinds of things that you explored in this book, or are you building on, everybody builds, but are you building in some particular way on what you've done? Lori.
I have a new project that's so different from this book, and people always ask me, like, how did that happen? So my new project is on sex workers in kind of the 19th century Wild West and how they invested their money. So it is generally gender and migration, but I picked it because of kind of an archival encounter when I was researching Icelanders that had been arrested for various things in Winnipeg. I found these giant stack of mugshots of sex workers from the city. And there was so much power in these pictures, like the way they were looking at the cameras, their stories, their names. And it was this kind of like archival moment that intervened, you know, and took me off to something different.
What are the, Danica?
If I can share my current research project, I'm studying the history of sugar in Canada from a global perspective. So I'm looking at where Canadian sugar was produced, and then how it was brought to Canada, and then how it was marketed and consumed. And that's been a huge project, but I think I went to that. I'm interested in the history of capitalism. I went to consumer culture because I wanted to understand sort of the consumer side of the history of capitalism. And I think that now I'm moving closer to understanding what corporations were doing and how that affected everyone involved within their, trajectories. So that's where I moved on from the history of consumer history, history of capitalism more broadly.
Other responses before we wrap up? Okay, well then, let me say that this has been really fun. Again, not as much fun as we would be and we will be again in person, but this has been a really great opportunity. Thanks, of course, to the authors and commentators. Thanks to Len Husband, with whom we have worked 51 books worth of collaboration. That's actually quite amazing. Thanks to behind the scenes, Anna and Jane from U of T. And let me say a personal thanks and right on to Franca Iacovetta, who's the person who not only came up with this brilliant idea, but did most of the legwork to contact everybody, to get commentators, etc. Franca is unstoppable, and it's really fun working with her. Thanks to everybody.
Okay, and just 2 more items. Congratulations to everyone. 2 more items from UTP. First, as I stated at the beginning, the recording of this book launch will be made available after the event. So when you receive the link, please feel free to share it widely. And second, the holidays are upon us, so please make sure you rush out and purchase copies of all 4 of these books. You can either purchase them directly from UTP. They're all currently discounted on our website, anywhere between 25 and 50% right now. Or please walk down to your local independent bookstore. They definitely need our help this time of year, and especially this year. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us, and please enjoy reading all 4 books.